Hello and welcome to CMG's webinar on comparison of numerical versus analytical models for EUR calculation and optimization in unconventional reservoirs. My name is Anjani Kumar. I'm the Vice President of Engineering Solutions and Marketing at CMG. I'm pleased to introduce Jim Erdle, Vice President for Software Sales and Support for USA and Latin America, who will be presenting today's webinar. Jim has 42 plus years of industry experience, primarily in reservoir and production engineering related positions within the services and software segments of the E&P industry since graduating from Penn State with a Bachelor of Science and PhD degree in petroleum engineering in '71 and '74. Early in his career, Jim was involved with some of the industry's leading advances in well testing design, monitoring and interpretation technology, including closed chamber and surface pressure readout drill stem testing, production enhancements via nodal analysis, stimulation treatment design and monitoring techniques, and production surveillance software. Jim joined CMG in May of 1997 and has been directly involved in improvements to CMG's technology, including the workflows available within CMG's products used to build, run, and analyze dynamic reservoir simulation models of unconventional shale gas and liquids-rich reservoirs. So that was the formal introduction of Jim Erdle. But internally, on a lighter note, we call Jim our rock star presenter on unconventional modeling capabilities. Jim has traveled all around the world presenting our workflow to various companies. How many continents and countries have you traveled and presented on our unconventional workflow, Jim?
Well, I think just about every continent except Antarctica, and probably a dozen or so countries included in that list.
So before we start our presentation, I'd like to inform you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. However, you may submit your question at any time using the chat window on your screen. We will also post the recorded presentation on our website within the next 24 hours. You can use your CMGL username and a password to log in and access the material. Over to you, Jim.
Okay. Thanks very much, Anjani. I really appreciate that introduction. And more importantly, I really appreciate the attendance of everyone out there in the audience. I'm going to try to make this as interesting and as informative as possible, and I really look forward to hearing some of your questions at the end of the presentation. So the agenda for today's workshop is, or webinar is, I'm going to introduce a little bit about CMG for those of you that may not be current users of our software. I'm going to discuss some of the reasons why people use reservoir simulation for their unconventional reservoirs. And then we'll describe the current state of CMG's tool set for doing unconventional reservoir modeling, including the physics available and the workflows enabled through the use of our software. And then we're going to dig right into the big topic of the day, which is comparing rate time analysis versus numerical modeling for determining estimated ultimate recoveries of unconventional reservoirs. And this is really a reprise of the SPE paper 180209 that we presented at the Low Perm Symposium in Denver a couple of weeks ago. Then we're going to talk a little bit about a subject that's caught my attention recently, the use of data analytics for predicting unconventional well performance. You might imagine I have some thoughts about that, and I'm going to try to convey those concisely toward the end of the talk. Then I'm going to make some conclusions about the two main topics, and then I am going to throw a little sales pitch in here for CMG at the end, you know, why I think people might want to use or consider using CMG for their unconventional reservoir modeling. Now on to the first topic, a little bit of a reprise as to what CMG does. We're in the reservoir simulation software business. That's our main business. We also do some consulting services, customized training, and research. We think that the use of reservoir simulation, along with our productivity enhancement tool, CMOS, really allows you to optimize your E&P investments, improve recovery, and it's done so for a relatively small investment compared to the value generated by the application of the tools. Our areas of specialization cover a lot of advanced enhanced oil recovery processes. That's not all we do, but this is kind of an interesting list that's getting a lot of attention out there these days, including low salinity water flooding, the unconventionals that we're talking about here today, chemical EOR, gas EOR, etc. A lot of use of these items, but not to say that we don't do a great job of conventional oil modeling, water flooding, etc. We do. It's just that these are the things that we tend to get more noted for. We have about 221 employees right now. I just like to show this slide because it emphasizes two main points. Our research and development staff working on developing our tools numbers 115 people right now. We think that, if not the largest, it's certainly one of the largest groups focusing specifically on reservoir simulation software. And our CST, that's our consulting, support, and training group spread around the world, numbers now about 50 people, about a quarter of the company's human resources, and they are a key link between you and our technology, and we're very proud of them, and we really emphasize the support function here at CMG. We are spread around the world now. Here's a global shot of our main offices. The items, the cities in the black font are actual CMG offices. The ones in blue are agent offices around the world that help us market and support our software. And again, for those of you that might not be familiar, this is our suite of tools. CMOS is I call it our productivity enhancement tool because it lets you run the reservoir simulators, IMEX for black oil, GEM for compositional, and STARS for thermal, in ways that make it very efficient to do history matching and optimization. CoFlow is a product that you'll hear more about. It's being co-developed with Petrobras and Shell, and we'll be introducing that commercially here within the next little while. We'll talk more about that later. Builder and results are our pre and post processors that make it easy to use and easy to analyze the output from our reservoir simulators. WinProp's our PVT package, and iSegWell is currently a feature inside of IMEX for doing multi-segmented wellbore modeling. Now let's move on to the subject at hand here. Why use reservoir simulation for unconventional reservoirs? I think there's a lot of reasons that fall under the category of doing physics-based EUR calculations and optimization as opposed to empirical modeling-based options. Why do you want to do that? Because most of these tight and shale type reservoirs with the permeabilities, the matrix permeabilities in the range from 1,000 to 100 nanodarcies, most of the history that we have of these wells is in transient flow. So we have very long times to pseudo-steady state, even between perf clusters, but certainly between stages and between wells. And while you're in transient flow, the traditional decline curve analysis methods just don't apply. Rate time analysis does have the advantage of being able to transient data, and that's why we're looking at it today compared to numerical modeling, but certainly standard decline curve analysis techniques don't apply. Multi-phase flow is occurring in a lot of the shale liquids reservoirs. That really demands the use of numerical modeling. Turbulent flow especially in the prop fracture conduits as you get close to the wellbore, that can be an issue that numerical modeling can handle. Multi-component phase behavior. When you get into near critical fluids, when you start looking at EUR projects, huff and puff projects to recover more oil, you're going to get yourself into a situation where only the numerical models can handle. Compaction of prop fractures and stimulated natural fractures. This is something we always include in our models for history matching shale reservoirs and tight reservoirs, and that's something that's very difficult to do outside the numerical modeling world. Of course, heterogeneous rock properties. Analytical solutions have to assume constant rock properties. Heterogeneous well completions, the fracture geometry, is it planar, is it complex? And then some cases we get into more advanced topics that only numerical modeling can handle. The application of geomechanics and even geochemistry has some interesting applications, and all of these things can be handled by numerical models, especially CMG's numerical models. So another reason why numerical modeling is considered to be necessary for a lot of these unconventionals, it's because of the way that you develop your shale properties. You want to look at analysis and forecasting of multi-well pad models. You want to look at modeling of refracts and infill drilling. You want to interpret production surveillance data like distributed temperature sensing, production logs, tracers. In summary, you want to account for many, many uncertain parameters simultaneously. And that's what the numerical modeling world, especially the version available from CMG, allows you to do. So let's just step by step go through the application of CMG's workflow to numerical modeling. The first thing you want to do is pick the reservoir simulator that has the required physics to match what you think is going on in a particular area. And this slide is pretty busy, but it does compare using IMEX, our black oil simulator, with GEM, our compositional simulator, and how that stacks up in various categories and what you might want to use for your particular application. Suffice it to say that both GEM and IMEX have the necessary physics to model these processes, everything from the correct PVT data to modeling adsorbed components to modeling natural fractures as well as prop fractures. And we always model our prop fractures explicitly with local grid refinement. We can handle non-Darcy flow in all areas of the reservoir. The terminology here, MT matrix, NF natural fractures, PF prop fractures. We can handle different rel perm and cap pressure behavior in each of those three regions. We can handle pressure dependent compaction differently in each of these three regions. And when pressure dependent compaction is not sufficient, we can move you over to GEM, where we can model stress dependent compaction using the geomechanics module that's in GEM. And of course, there may be some interesting applications. We're not going to talk about them today, but for geochemistry in this whole unconventional world. So we have the necessary physics, but I will say this, that we try to get people to mostly start with IMEX for modeling history matching and production of primary forecasting of primary production. We can get you into GEM if your fluids are near critical, if you're trying to model a gas injection EUR process. And also, another very important aspect here that we like to deal with is the handling of both planar and complex fracturing and the application of our locally refined, logarithmically spaced grids to those scenarios so that we can model transient flow from the matrix to the fracture. This is just a little close-up look of a single planar fracture where the blue line represents the prop fracture representing a planar fracture, and you can see the logarithmic spacing of the gridding away from that. That's absolutely necessary to capture and model the transient flow from the matrix to the fracture when you're in the nano-Darcy level of matrix permeability. This is the application of complex intersecting planar fractures to represent complex fractures as opposed to planar fractures. So that's step one. The next step in the process is to build a base case model, and that's where Builder comes in. With Builder, we make it very easy to bring in your geologic model or to create a geologic model in Builder and then apply the necessary gridding to represent planar or complex fracturing. This is just kind of a summary slide showing the planar and complex fractures and the fact that in Builder we make it easy to create the proper gridding, not overkill, not logarithmic spacing in two directions all over the whole model, but locally refined grids to represent the transient flow to the matrix, from the matrix to the fractures. This is just a bit of a picture of the latest version of Builder that allows you to create planar fractures, complex fractures, or actually import frac calculations from external packages like Gopher, StimPlan, FracPro PT, fracturing software from FracGeo, and FieldPro. And you can see how those can be totally non-symmetrical fractures, variable conductivity fractures, bringing the data in from those packages. And this is another example of frac software design brought in from FracGeo. You can see that the planar fractures are not just symmetrical, perfectly lined up fractures. And here's an example showing the importation of microseismic data or something like microseismic data that can be used to delineate the geometry and the size and shape of the fractures that occurred during a particular frac job. So once you build a base case model, Then it's up to the engineer to decide what parameters you feel uncertain about, which in the unconventional world can be quite a few. In fact, that's where CMOS comes in, because you're going to be able to do sensitivity analysis to pick which parameters are having the most impact on the production that you've observed in a given well. And then you're going to be able to do probabilistic history matching now and probabilistic forecasting so that you can calculate an EUR that has assigned to it P10, P50, and P90 values. We think that's very important. It's a fairly recent advance in CMOS capability as of last fall. A lot of you may not be using the probabilistic approach, but it's there now and it's pretty efficient. And of course, it can be applied to optimization as well. Here's a slide that really summarizes it. It's one thing to be able to design a base case model with the right gridding to represent transient flow, but it's another thing to have a tool like CMOS that can let you parameterize dozens of important variables, give each of those variables a range of values or continuous, whether they're continuous or discrete variables, and then let CMOS go through the process of telling you which one of those are most important and what the probable values are for those parameters. Things like frac properties, frac half-length, width, permeability, the effective spacing between planar fractures, the height above and height below the perf intervals that the production data says that the frac must have encountered, and perm gradients from tip to wellbore, and stimulated natural fracture properties like the width and the perm. These are all things that can be parameterized by CMOS without the user having to go in and create new models to represent different values. It's all automated, folks. It really works great. And if you're importing microseismic data, we can even parameterize how many events you want to have included in a grid block or have to be in a grid block for you to consider it to be a stimulated grid block. Other parameters, anything you've brought over from your microseismic interpretation. And a typical workflow, sensitivity analysis first. Here's a tornado plot showing in this particular case that the cumulative oil production from this particular well is most sensitive to matrix permeability. You can see the big bar here representing the range. Prop frac spacing and fracture half-length are the next most important things. These all make intuitive sense, but this is actually a result of a full analysis where CMOS has come out and said, in this particular instance, these are the most important parameters. So ideally, you could go into a history match with probably just the top 4 or 5 of these, but CMOS is so effective that history matching with 4 or 5 sensitivity parameters, or even 8 or 9, is really not very difficult in these wells. And that's something that I really want to emphasize as I go through here. The time it takes to apply numerical simulation to history matching and optimizing single wells, even multi-well pads, is surprisingly fast, surprisingly fast. You'll see that later on here. Here's what you look at while you're doing history matching in CMOS. You're looking at the global objective function decreasing as the number of runs goes up on the x-axis. The base case history match error in this case is what I'm pointing to. That little black dot is the model, that the base case model that the engineer built. All these other runs are done automatically by CMOS. It looks at the results of the base case run and future runs, and it analyzes that data. It uses its hybrid optimizing technology to determine what combinations of variables to look at next. And as you can see, it has a wide search space in the beginning and narrows it down to where even before we get to the 100th run, we're starting to see minimum history match error combinations. And this is something that you see on the screen. You're not doing anything but observing this at this point, so hopefully you're working on your next 5 projects while CMOS is running this one for you. Big advance we made last fall, and it's in the upcoming 2016 general release too, is going from doing deterministic forecasting to doing probabilistic forecasting, where you're going to be able to calculate the P10, P50, and P90 results. And this is all done with Bayes' theorem. We have a version of that that's in our software, and it's very efficient because we have a really nice new way to do this that doesn't require the the thousands of runs that Markov chain Monte Carlo technique requires. We have a new special technique called PAR for doing that. Here's another example of optimizing. We're looking at cume production from different well spacings, well densities in a 640-acre section, from 1 well per section all the way up to 7 wells per section. We're always getting more oil, but because of the cost, you can see over here the NPV maxes out at about 7 wells per section. These are the kinds of things you can do with the workflows that we have inside of our software. So this is a summary, the workflows, and the key thing here is that as the user of this technology, you really only have to build a base case model, decide which parameters you want to allow CMOS to vary, and then CMOS does all the rest of the work for you. So at this point, I'm going to pause for a second. We're going to get into our RTA versus CMG comparison, but Anjani is going to pose a question to the audience, and we hope that you'll respond.
So basically, at this point, I like to ask a question to all the attendees is, how do your EUR forecasts change with time? What Jim means to ask is, do you have to change your forecast from time to time depending on the data and more data you get from the field, or depending on the tools that you use? There are 4 options on the screen, and you can respond by clicking on one of those. The 4 options are stays fairly constant, decline with time, increase with time, and are erratic. And we'll just give a few seconds for everybody to respond. There's responses coming up indicating, so 19% say that they stay fairly constant, around 40% say they decline with time, 13% increase with time, and 28% say it's about erratic. So what do you make out of these responses, Jim?
Well, there's no doubt that if you're using decline curve analysis and even rate time analysis, as we'll see in this next talk, I would expect to see that the numbers changing with time.
Yeah. The other interesting aspect could have been is to correlate these with the forecasting tools that the individuals are using, which leads to some varying results in the EUR forecast. So hopefully in today's talk you will highlight some of the important aspects of using different tools for long-term EUR forecast. Back to you, Jim.
That's right. Thanks, Anjani, and thanks for all of your responses. So let's get on to this topic. The motivation for this paper and for this part of our webinar is that we know there's a lot of use of traditional decline curve technology for doing EURs for unconventional reservoirs, and also rate time analysis, which we think is actually a little more applicable than standard decline curve analysis. And believe me, in this talk, we're not trying to tell you not to use RTA. I think the message that you're going to hear us say is check the results once in a while. But there's a lot of people using RTA. There's definitely a lot of people using numerical simulation. The original polling questions show there's a pretty interesting breakdown between who's using DCA, RTA, and numerical modeling for their unconventionals, and maybe we can share the results of that toward the end of the talk here. So anyway, we wanted to try to quantify some of the differences you might expect to get. So the outline for this part of the talk is first a review of the numerical workflow for unconventional reservoirs. We don't really need to do that right now because we just did that prior to this page. But we do need to talk a little bit about the RTA workflow that we used for comparing to our numerical workflow. And I will just say this, we used the RTA package that's inside of Paquette for this. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. We're going to do some model validation work comparing the techniques under situations where they should give you the same answer. We're then going to look at what happens when we start getting real-world scenarios that might deviate from the assumptions of the underlying analytical models that are in RTA. Then we're going to talk about computational performance. Can you even afford to do numerical modeling on unconventional wells? We'll take a look at that. And then we'll come up with a couple of conclusions. So again, the unconventionals workflow for CMG, we don't need to revisit this. I just wanted to remind you that this is what we're talking about. The RTA workflow that's in the FICET package has two analytical models for multi-fractured horizontal wells. One's called the general horizontal multifrac model. The other is called the horizontal multifrac enhanced region model. You'll see a picture of the differences of those on the next slide. It also has a history matching technique called automatic parameter estimation. It's a multivariable optimization technique that allows you to set up different parameters to allow to be varied to get a match depending on which of those models that you pick. The key thing here is that the production forecast that results from that history match is a single deterministic value, okay? Whereas with the numerical approach, we're going to give you the P50, P90, P10 range of values. So here's the picture of what the two analytical models allow you to do. You can see the general horizontal multifrac model allows you to have varying half-length fractures, whereas the horizontal multifrac enhanced model doesn't, but it does allow you to include a region of enhanced permeability around those wells. So here's the approach we used. We wanted to, first of all, validate that we get the same answer from RTA versus numerical modeling under conditions where the model assumptions are equal to those of the analytical solution, okay? So we did this by creating a very finely gridded numerical model of a 4 planar fracture model that you can see over here on the right, okay? And when I say finely gridded, the red fracture quarters in this case are taken all the way down. The grid size is all the way down to prop fracture width, which is a fraction of an inch, okay? Then we created a numerical model using our logarithmically spaced, locally refined gridding technique, which includes pseudoizing the width of that fracture up to 2 feet. But remember, we modify the conductivity of that fracture so that the equivalent conductivity is exactly the same. And we also, when using non-Darcy flow, we modify the Forsheimer equation coefficients so we get the same non-Darcy flow pressure loss that we would get if the actual frac width were taken all the way down to prop frac width. And then we, of course, created the same model in the analytical world, the RTA world, using the general horizontal multifrac. So in order to keep things the same between analytical and numerical in this case, we did model a shale oil reservoir, but it's highly undersaturated like we do see in a lot of the shale basins around the U.S., so that we're never encountering multi-phase flow in the reservoir or in the fractures during the production history. This just reemphasizes those points. All the things that are pertaining to analytical solutions, like the porosity and perms, have to be homogeneous, fully penetrating fractures, equal frac half-length and dimensionless conductivity, and no fracture compaction. And this is just a list of the parameters that were used to generate this model. So what we're seeing here is a comparison between the fine-scale reference model, which is the blue dots, the analytical model from RTA, which is the dashed brown lines, and of course the purple dashed lines, which is our pseudoized width model, if you want to call it, of the same well. And you can see that these rate curves fall right on top of each other, showing, in my opinion, that there's validation that the numerical model is giving the same results as the analytical solution. And the production at the end of the forecast period, you can see they're almost dead on. So that's pretty good validation. We like to do that a lot with numerical models. When we test things, we compare them to analytical solutions to make sure we get the same results when things are homogeneous and when things fit the assumptions of the analytical solution. And a lot of people, some like to look at the results of this. This shows that in this case, which remember was 100 nanodarcies perm, we don't start to see interference between the fractures in here that are 100 feet apart until about a year's worth of production time. Now we're going to start looking one complexity at a time at what happens when one of those model assumptions of the analytical solution is violated. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 different complexities. We're going to run a fine grid numerical model for 30 years to generate the reference solution. And then we're going to provide the first 2 years of that forecast to both RTA and to the CMG workflow to do history matching and forecasting, just to see how well we match the the correct solution for the production at the end of 30 years. And the 4 different scenarios that we looked at individually, one change at a time, are fracture conductivity loss through compaction, partially penetrating fractures, which the analytical solution cannot deal with, presence of water from the frac treatment in the fractures at the beginning of the production period, and then presence of two-phase flow by producing the well way below the bubble point and having pressures dropping below the bubble point in the matrix during the forecast period. The numerical simulation workflow generates an ensemble of models so that we ensure a satisfactory history match. And in this case, we're going to take the 11 best history match models for carrying forward into the forecast period. We then apply statistical techniques to determine the P90, P50, and P10 case. And we're going to focus mostly on the numerical results from the P50 models. Here are the history match results in terms of the oil rate match for all 4 of these scenarios. And you can see that you can tweak the model parameters to get a good match, a fairly good match in all 4 cases. But let's see what that does for us in terms of the forecast production and the reservoir parameters that we've derived from history matching. Are they going to be as comparable as these rate matches? You might suspect that maybe not so. Here are the forecast productions from the history matches for both RTA and the CMG workflow. And you can see that there's deviations between the RTA forecast and those from the numerical forecast, and that the numerical forecast is usually very close to being right on with the reference solution. So in terms of the whole full range of values that we create with our probabilistic forecasting, here are those ranges just for the CMG approach, because the RTA approach doesn't give you those ranges, just to give you an idea of what's going on. And this is a summary, and it's a very busy table, but I do want to point out here that 2 main areas of this thing. Over here on the far left-hand column, we have a listing of the 4 scenarios, the 4 deviations from analytical model capabilities. The reference values were held constant for frac half-length, dimensionless conductivity. The 3rd parameter associated with the scenario is obviously something different. The RTA-based history match parameters, you can see vary quite severely compared to the reference values. Like for the fracture conductivity loss, the RTA method, even though it was a good rate match, comes up with a fracture half-length of 273 feet versus the reference case of 400. Whereas if we look at the simulation P50 model, the fracture half-length is 406 versus 400. And this is pretty consistent behavior for all the scenarios. The numerical model gives you much closer matches to the correct reservoir parameters than the RTA technique does, because the RTA technique is trying to adjust for physics that it doesn't have. Okay. Also on the EUR forecasts, the reference EURs are shown here in this white column. So for the fracture conductivity loss, the correct value is about 37,000 barrels. RTA gives a value of about 13% lower than that, whereas the P50 simulation value is basically right on, and that's pretty consistent throughout this whole process. The RTA workflows, looking at 1 deviation at a time, underpredict the correct value of EUR for anywhere from 7 to 13%, whereas the P50 values in all 4 cases for the simulation workflow are within 1% of the correct value. So let's take a look now at what happens if I invoke all 4 of those deviations at one time, and we're going to create a much bigger well with more well length of almost a mile long. There's going to be 30 planar fractures. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to generate a reference value, provide 26 months of history to RTA and 26 months of history to the CMG approach, and see who can come up with the correct answer for the EUR and the reservoir parameters. We're also going to do something else very interesting here as we look at the reservoir parameters that were actually used to generate the reference case. We're going to drive the history part of this model with a pressure history from a real well out in the field, and we all know how much variation there is in rates and pressures, And so this isn't going to create a nice smooth little decline curve analysis for people to work on. And one other factor here, I skipped that slide, I realize I'm trying to catch up on my time here. We also wanted to look at the impact of the amount of production history that you have to work with. How does that affect the answer that you come up with? Because I get asked this all the time. How much data do we need to have before we can get a reliable estimate of EURs from our workflows with unconventional wells? So here are the history matches, the rate matches for all 4 cases. Here where we're talking about having 26 months of history, only 12 months, only 6 months, and only 3 months. Okay? So the history matches, again, on rate data don't look that particularly bad. But look what happens when we start projecting out into the future. The numerical technique tends to predict the right value of cum production regardless of amount of the history that it had to work with. Whereas as you can see, the RTA method gets worse and worse and worse. It's under-predicting more and more dramatically as you get less historical data, to the point where we're down to 60% under-predicting the EUR when we only have 3 months worth of data to start with. So 16% under at 26 months, all the way to 60% under for only 3 months of history. And look at the blue numbers here. The EURs from the numerical approach actually are very, very consistent at less than 2% error. We don't really have time right now to delve into all the reservoir parameters, but the numerical approach always gives closer matches to the reference values for reservoir parameters than does the RTA approach. That's something to really pay attention to here. So this kind of summarizes the impact of history, how much history you have on the x-axis versus the EUR error. You can see the numerical approach has a small error and is very consistent. The RTA approach has a dramatic error. That's why I asked the question at the beginning of this section, do you notice your EUR estimates changing versus time? Well, I'm not saying that this example is representative of the whole world, but it is an example. And I can only imagine that it would be possible to generate all kinds of additional cases to delve further into this subject. But I say this is a warning sign that says that you're going to do your RTAs, no problem, but you should be checking the results once in a while with a numerical workflow. And the numerical workflow is doable. In the case that you see here, the total amount of time to do the work ranged from 2 hours to 11 hours. And this is all the hundreds of simulation runs that we're making, 600 simulation runs for each history match. A total of 41 simulator runs were made for each forecast. All the forecasts were done all the way out to June of 2040. And here we're taking advantage of the fact that CMOS can make multiple simultaneous runs of the IMEX simulator in this case. These runs, each individual run takes a couple of minutes. It's amazing how fast this can be done. So at this point, we're going to pause one more time for an audience response question. So Anjani, take it away.
The question that I like to ask the audience is, does your company use data analytics to forecast production from unconventional wells? The 3 options are yes, no, I do not know. We will just give a few seconds here. It's a fairly new concept that has started coming up, and we are hearing about it. There are presentations at various conferences on this subject. So the responses are showing that there are 51% of the attendees who actually do use data analytics for production forecasting and unconventional wells. 26% no, and 25% say we do not know. So there is an increasing trend in using data analytics for production forecasting. And as Jim mentioned in his previous talk here, is that although RTA-based forecasting have some physics built into it, and still you see a lot of variability, whereas data analytics is a fairly new concept which is based on no physics at all, just based on data. So one can imagine how much uncertainty it can have, and hopefully Jim can shed further light on that in the next few slides. Jim?
Okay. As indicated in your poll, data analytics seems to be becoming popular these days. I'm not here to bash data analytics. I'm just trying to identify whether or not it can actually be useful for predicting production performance. I'm a big believer in it for other things like calculating mean time to failure of pump strings, all that type of stuff. But what about applying it to well performance prediction? And my message here is caution is warranted. We all know that there are several techniques that people are using for predicting unconventional well results. We just talked about rate time analysis and numerical simulation, but I'm seeing more and more often people using data analytics. And actually, a lot of the people using this are kind of bragging about not using physics in their models. So I wanted to create a scenario or a case where I could determine what the impact of that might be, not using reservoir parameters or physics as the predictors for data analytics, and what the impact of that might be. So this slide's pretty busy, but I think this does a pretty good job of suggesting what reservoir and well parameters and fracture parameters really you would need to specify in order to predict production from unconventional wells. And the way that I've seen data analytics treat these parameters is as follows. Normally, I don't see any of the first 5 items going in as reservoir parameters or any type of parameters, predictor parameters, into a data analytics forecast. They tend to lump all of this stuff into 2 parameters, X, Y location of the well. Okay? And then when it comes to the hydraulic fracture treatment results, they don't input the things that actually control production from the well, like the frac half lengths and the properties of those fractures. They tend to look at the things that were used to create those fractures, the number of stages, the number of perf clusters, the fluid type, the frac fluid type, the pump rate and volume, the size and amount. The well completion design, because that's readily available, is usually used as is, as predictors in the analytical world. And then the well operating conditions are usually ignored. Okay? So I wanted to create a case that would give us a sense of what the impact would be by ignoring the 5 items in the XY location property and the number 8 item here, and also the fact that the same amount of fluid and proppant pump can create widely different distributions of fracture properties. So here's what I did. I created a case with fixed properties for all 5 of the items in that red box. I then created a series of cases where the number of fracs, the frac half length, the frac height, spacing, and perm, they're all going to be variable, but they're done in such a way as that the total fracture surface area is constant for all the cases, which really to me would equate to assuming the same amount of fluid pumped and the same amount of proppant pumped. And then the well completion data is all going to be fixed, and I am going to allow the well operating conditions to vary, because obviously that can happen. So with all of these things fixed and the frac configurations and the bottom hole pressure allowing to vary, what sort of range in cum production might you expect to see from this in a scenario where otherwise the data analytics folks would be looking for one number to correlate to, a constant value, whatever that turns out to be? Well, with this range of parameters, and I know we don't have time to go through this right now, I just want to reemphasize that the frac surface area for all the cases you're going to see plotted on the next slide are exactly the same. Okay? And these are the configurations of the fractures. So this is the plot that I really want to focus on. It shows that for all of those fixed values of reservoir properties and frac surface area and all that, the actual production cum can range, and this is just a 3-year cum in this case, from a minimum of 73,000 barrels to a maximum of 218,000 barrels. Now, if data analytics is hoping that this would be one number from this well, I don't see how it can be a predictor of future behavior when it doesn't know anything about the configuration of the fractures, it doesn't know anything about the reservoir properties, etc. I just think this is a big warning message right here to the industry. And if you're on the reservoir engineering side of this equation, I think you just need to be aware that people are trying to say that you can model these wells without considering physics, and I don't see how that's possible. Just my opinion. I'd love to get questions from your side or comments as to what you think about that, but I think this particular application shows exactly that concern. So we're going to wrap up. A couple of conclusions from the RTA versus CMG numerical workflow portion of the webinar. I think the CMG's numerical solution-based workflow for unconventional wells were shown to be more accurate and consistent than the RTA-based workflow, and that it's sufficiently fast to be employed as a routine calibration tool for the results derived from other less physics-based methods like RTA and certainly decline curve analysis. I'm not naive enough to think that you're going to just drop the use of RTA and decline curve analysis, but I do think you should once in a while do a calibration check, and I think it's fairly easy to do that. And also, from the talk that we just finished, data analytics is a poor predictor of unconventional well performance without at least considering the use of reservoir and completion parameters as predictors, which they don't like to do because unless you do a numerical model, do history matching, you're not going to know what those things are. So those are my main conclusions there. And now to wrap up, I said I was going to have a little bit of a marketing pitch. I've got 30 seconds to do it. So why use CMG for this modeling work? Because we have the required physics to do the history matching and forecasting. We make it very easy through Builder to import geologic models from leading 2D and 3D geologic modeling tools to jumpstart your workflow. Or even if you just want to create a cookie cutter model inside of CMG from logs or cores or just right out of your head, you can do it. We make it easy to add the gridding to represent planar and complex or mixed geometry fractures, including importing data from leading frac design software. We make it easy to import microseismic data into the building process. We make it easy and efficient to build single and multi-well models. We make it easy to parameterize reservoir and hydraulic fracture properties and sizes for history matching and optimization. And our track record of enhancements to our software for modeling unconventional wells we think is second to none. This is a bit of a timeline that shows you that we've really been into this since the beginning of the shale boom in the U.S. and Canada, and now having just added probabilistic EUR workflow in 2016, we think we're ahead of the competition there. The SPE literature suggests that CMG is widely used in a lot of different areas. I did a quick search on onepetro.org before this conference looking for papers with CMG featured. Over 525 papers over the last 6 years, so 5.5 years actually, 74 relating directly to shale, and 25 of those were on EUR technologies being applied to shales. This is a list of E&P companies who have licensed CMG to model unconventional reservoirs over the last few years. That list totals 56 E&P companies. Some of those might be the ones you're in. And in the consulting world, we have another 19 companies, service and consulting companies using our software. So believe me, if you're not using CMG right now and you're concerned about whether you should consider it, you won't be alone. There's a lot of people out there already using us for this. And so that is my webinar conclusion, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm glad to take any questions that we might have time to incorporate.
Thank you, Jim. We will now take up questions. If you have any questions and have not already submitted it, you can do so using the chat window on the screen. I see there are a lot of questions already in here, so time permitting, we'd like to take all of them, but let's see. The first question is from Franklin, and the question is, what are the main factors in terms of geomechanics to consider when choosing GEM or IMEX for unconventional simulation?
Okay, well, number one, the geomechanics capability that we have is only in GEM. Okay, it is not in IMEX right now. But in terms of getting started with geomechanics, you don't have to go crazy with a complete detail. We need to have Young's modulus. We need to have Poisson's ratio. And actually, you can get started looking at things like drawdown sensitivity, stress-dependent perm sensitivity, just with that initial case. We can work directly off the flow simulation grid that you build to create a geomechanics grid, or we can use a completely independent grid to represent the geomechanics grid, which is sometimes pretty convenient to do. So yeah, I'm always of a mind that you don't have to throw the kitchen sink in to build your initial model. Start simple, try to understand the processes going on, and then you can work your way up as you need to. But I will say this, our geomechanics module also can account for natural fractures, and that's not necessarily typical.
The next question is from Palash, and the question is, operating a well at 2,000 psi above the bubble point pressure is not practical in RTA. I think what he's saying is the reason why we used it is because we didn't want to go into the two-phase, and we wanted to operate the well above the bubble point pressure so that we meet the criteria and limitation of the RTA tool, so that we can have a representative case to compare between RTA and reservoir simulation.
Right, that was one case, but for the fourth scenario there, we did operate below the bubble point pressure, and in the realistic case where we applied all four scenarios simultaneously, we were definitely operating below the bubble point pressure.
The next question is from Ellie, and the question is, what are some of the instances where RTA EUR prediction is higher than reference solution EUR prediction? Have you seen something like that?
It's amazing. We haven't. We have done dozens and dozens of history matches and forecasts for people using our workflow, and the ones that they send to us for support cases, I don't recall ever seeing a case where RTA-derived EURs have been greater or even equal to the numerical model derived. Once we did this work for SPE paper 180209, it rung a bell, resonated amongst our whole CST group in Houston and Calgary, where we said, yeah, we're seeing this all the time. We're independent work for people. We give them an EUR number or a range of numbers, and they come back and they tell us, yeah, those are bigger than our RTA numbers. And oddly enough, a lot of people say, well, why is the numerical model different than the RTA when all the physics is different? You know, it's kind of like people would love to have their results match their RTA, but I'm sorry, sometimes RTA is just not good enough.
So the next question is from Pablo, and the question is, what about to include the linear flow parameters in data analytics instead of non-physics parameters like IP or tune volumes?
Well, I think the problem with that is how are you going to get that? Where are you going to get that information from to put into data analytics? You know, data analytics is popular because it relies on data that's readily stored on all of these wells. And unfortunately, the databases that you go to, whether they're public or internal to a company, unless they've analyzed the wells with numerical techniques, they don't have a lot of this data to use as predictor. I'm not saying it can't be done. There was a recent SPE paper at the Lone Perm Symposium where the data analytics was combined with numerical modeling to use reservoir properties as predictors, and that actually works out a whole lot better.
The next question is from Kashif, and he'd like to know, how do you figure out when does the absorption phase end during shale gas production in CMG?
When does it end? Well, I think we can track separately adsorbed gas production from free gas production, and that's the way I would check it out, actually. It's really more of a question of when does it begin. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you'll have to look at your absorption isotherm that you input, the relationship with pressure, and then you can monitor the amount of adsorbed gas with time.
And there's one other thing I want to say about modeling adsorbed gas. it's another reason why you need to have the logarithmically spaced grids near the well, because you're going to have pressure drop below the desorption pressure close to the prop fractures and natural fractures a lot sooner than it's going to happen if you were only using big grid blocks in your model. So to properly model production of adsorbed gas, you really need to have logarithmic spacing away from your prop fractures.
The next question is from Kelvin, and the question is, can CMG, GEM, or IMX model stress cycling effect on proppant and associated loss in production in fractured wells?
Yes, both our pressure-dependent compaction and our geomechanics can account for hysteresis effects. In fact, the geomechanics module has a couple of constitutive models that handle creep, and creep actually can be, you know, a part of this process.
The next question is from Mahmoud, and the question is logarithmically refined spacing for the grade required for micro-Darcy rocks?
You really have to look at the overall mobility to answer that question, because it's really about time for pressure waves to migrate through the reservoir, and so it's a function of permeability and viscosity, okay, and compressibility. So micro-Darcy is getting toward the area where you might not have to go logarithmic, but you really need to do a comparison case to see if it's going to make a big difference.
The next question is from C. Allen, and the question is, how reliable are those base case solutions you presented in simulation versus RTI, since they are all from simulation and most of them do not have an analytical solution?
I'm not sure I quite understand that problem, but I think one way I would interpret it is saying, is our workflow results being biased by the fact that we're using the same simulator to generate the cases? I don't actually think so. I think it's the only way you can really do a true comparison, because if we work with field data, we might argue that we don't really know the reference answer. You know, so this is the way that the only way I know of to get a fair comparison.
Thank you, Jim. For sake of time, we will have to stop the Q&A here. I see a lot of questions. It's approximately more than 50 or 60 questions that I see here, and we will get back to you individually with all of these questions and answers to these questions within the next few days. I hope you have gained a better understanding of using numerical simulation for EUR calculation and optimization of production from unconventional reservoirs. CMG does offer a multitude of training courses for various skill levels. For those of you who are interested in knowing more about CMG's unconventional reservoir modeling workflows, we do offer two-day courses, one focused more on unconventional gas reservoirs. The second one focuses on liquids-rich and shale oil applications. We also do company-specific customized courses on a variety of other subjects all around the world. For more information related to our training course offerings, I invite you to visit our website and check out the course offerings there. We will post the recorded version of this presentation or the webinar on our website within the next 24 hours. You can use your CMGL login and a username pass to access the material. Again, we will get back to you individually with all the questions that have come in during the Q&A session. If you have any other questions related to the material presented today, or you'd like to know more about the CMG product offerings, I invite you to contact sales@cmgl.ca. Again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar on comparison of numerical and analytical models for EUR calculation and optimization in conventional reservoirs. And Jim would like to highlight something that came up recently. Jim?
Yes, I just want to add that if you want to read more about this, I did a chapter in a recently published book from the SPEE on estimating ultimate recovery of developed wells and low perm reservoirs. I did the chapter on applying numerical models, chapter 8. You can see a picture of that here. So you might want to look at this as another reference for this process. I describe the workflow in here that we use to analyze these wells. Again, I want to thank you as well myself, and look forward to entertaining any questions, and maybe we'll see you in Dubai at the ATCE for some of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.